So I think the insanity deal is used too loosely when it comes to certain people of like the race, especially the white race in particular, when certain things happen. Like for instance, Dylan Roof when he shot up that church, and pretty much they were pretty much saying he has like a mental disorder when really he really didn't. If he was able to do research on the church and walk into the church and murder those innocent people.
Depends on the crime. If it's something that's like really serious, like rape or murder, well, rape should never be okay. Even if you have temporary insanity, that should obviously make you go to jail or prison or whatever. But with different murder charges and stuff, I think it should only be okay if you have like proper documentation for it, like your mom was psychotic or you're psychotic or something.
Hi everybody, today we're going to be discussing a very important question, and that is the connection between mental illness and criminal activity. You just heard from a couple of my lovely colleagues about their opinion on this topic, and now we're going to be going into it a little bit further, starting with the justice system. So the first solid definition of the insanity defense was established in the early 1800s when a guy named McNaughton tried to assassinate the prime minister, and under his justification he was being followed by the government and they were tracking him, they were placing bugs in him, all that kind of stuff, and it was pretty much the modern day definition of paranoia or schizophrenic delusions. So there was nothing around at that time to actually defend him by insanity, so he made his own rule, which is now known as the McNaughton Rule. To establish a defense on the grounds of insanity, it must be clearly proven that, at the time of committing the act, the partly accused was laboring under such a defective reason, from disease of the mind, as to not know the nature or quality of the act he was doing, or if he did know it, that he did not know what he was doing was wrong. This means exactly what it's saying, and a defective reasoning is like a logical fallacy or something that's so preposterous and absurd that it can't possibly be true, and this is used as the basis for a lot of modern-day insanity defense laws as well. And it varies state by state, but it all follows the same basic outline. If you can't be held in your right mind, then you aren't responsible morally or mentally for the crime that you have committed. But who are we going to decide whether or not somebody is competent to stand trial or competent to commit a murder? I mean, isn't that just a little bit hypocritical? Like, we're not... So, before I move on, I'm going to explain to you really fast what happens after the insanity defense is used. So, first, the judge and the jury, sometimes just a judge, will decide whether or not it is credible to use, using a team of psychiatrists, the person's own testimony, and family members on occasion, like their mother or their father or another guardian that has been with them for a long time. And if it is decided that it is credible, either they will be sentenced as not liable to stand trial, in which case they will not be able to testify for themselves. Their lawyer, in some cases, will just stand for them, or the case itself will just go out the window or be pushed off to a much later date when the person has been committed into a psychiatrist institute or therapy session. Or the person will be given a lesser charge for the crime they have committed. So this means that if they have committed a murder, for instance, it will be cut down from a first degree to a second degree. And this is a big deal because first degree murder is something that was a purposeful killing of somebody else and was planned and meticulously thought out. They wanted to murder that person. And that is usually a lifelong sentence, and it is very much serious. A second degree murder either can be considered as something that was accidental or was planning to harm the person but not necessarily killing the person. That usually is a little bit less of a charge, maybe like 10 years at the least, but it's not life. So that is another big deal. Sometimes it can even be taken down to manslaughter. Manslaughter is an even less serious defense, it is something that is completely accidental. It is, for instance, it is like a vehicular manslaughter, or an incident that happens like in a vehicle or a motor shop where a heavy tool or something comes down and injures the person and kills them. Completely accidental, nobody meant to hurt anybody, but it happens. And that is an even less charge. It is probably 5 years maybe. It is still a felony, but you're not in jail for the majority of your life. So to take a person's sentence down from first degree murder down to vehicular manslaughter or manslaughter, that in itself is a very big deal, and a lot of lawyers are pulling to see if they can use that insanity defense wherever it could possibly be implemented. And of course these lines get blurred and people don't know what is actually real and what is just another silly reasoning of the court and many lawyers. So now I'm going to explain to you exactly what's going on in the brain of a criminal. I'm going to start out with a overview of the 3 main chemicals of the brain and what they do in impacting behavior. So we have dopamine, norepinephrine, and serotonin. Serotonin is your impulses and obsessive behaviors. This often comes into play when you think about OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. Dopamine is your excitement and energy factor. It's the chemical that is triggered when you have caffeine or sugar, or when you have certain types of over-the-counter drugs. And then norepinephrine is the reward, pleasure, and attention side. This is often triggered when you think of love, when you think of a compliment, things like that. It's very easy to trigger. It's really hard to understand if something is wrong with it, too. So the majority of people, when they think of low serotonin levels, they of course think of somebody being way fixated on something negative. And this, of course, is a very big factor when you think of criminal behavior, because people often think of fixated on a certain type of criminal or a certain type of crime or victim is always, of course, looked upon negatively, and it is negative. Dopamine, there are plenty of positive and negative contributing factors to this. When you think of drugs being used, this is usually the goal of people who are taking drugs, is to trigger the dopamine, and it gives you that temporary shot of excitement or detachment from reality. Like I said earlier, norepinephrine is a very hard to pin down chemical, and most people have never even heard of it. It's very hard to pronounce also.
Another aspect of severe mental illness, such as schizophrenia, is the related brain structures. When we look at even prior to onset of schizophrenia, we can detect, if we were doing CT scans and MRI scans, we can see significant brain changes compared to what we call a neurotypical brain, one without schizophrenia, one without mental illness. And what we see is those structural brain differences among those with schizophrenia. We can actually see that in the gray and the white matter of those, again, with schizophrenia. What we also know is that with successive bouts of psychotic episodes, in other words, that first psychotic episode followed by subsequent episodes, each episode hits that brain a little bit harder and a little bit harder. So if we did 5 years, 10 years post and did more brain scans, we can actually see the deterioration or the atrophy of brain tissue. What we can also see is structures like ventricles. Ventricles are just fluid-filled spaces of the brain. They actually expand. The ventricles are like the shape of a butterfly. We see larger spaces there, among other changes. So A lot of the research now is centered around first episode psychosis. What we're trying to do is to prevent subsequent episodes so that we can preserve brain mass. You asked about how are individuals diagnosed, or what are the diagnostic procedures for finding a mental illness. Typically that comes when there is some kind of an erratic behavior, some kind of psychotic break, not being able to tell real from not real. Those would include hallucinations, seeing, hearing things that others don't, and having delusions, fixed beliefs not grounded in reality, like my neighbors are spies and I've got to protect myself from them, or I'm on a special mission from the government and only I can save Chattanooga from the Twin Towers blowing up. So there's some kind of bizarre kinds of behaviors that are not typical, and somebody being very paranoid and fearful that somebody's going to hurt them, or they may be hearing things again that others don't, telling them to do things to hurt themselves or perhaps others sometimes. Often these individuals come into contact with law enforcement and not the mental health community. So these individuals then are transported either to an emergency department at a hospital, or we are fortunate to have the Chattanooga Walk-In Center with Johnson Mental Health, and individuals who are not violent and there's not a high risk of aggression or elopement or leaving the premises, then they can be taken there and be evaluated by a mental health professional. How an individual's mood, mindset, or affect are impaired or affected by these mental illnesses, it really depends on the mental illness, such as major depression, where people have thoughts that life is hopeless and nothing is going to get any better. They may have suicidal thoughts. They have an inability to build and maintain relationships, ability to do work, and so forth. With schizophrenia, we have a thought disorder where they don't think in a linear fashion. They don't connect the dots, and if you could understand what they were saying, they don't finish one thought before they go to the next, and they're sort of all over the map, not connected. And even if you could understand it, it doesn't make any sense. And again, sometimes they have hallucinations, sometimes they have paranoia, sometimes they have those delusions, fixed beliefs not grounded in reality. So it can affect their thinking, their behaving, their feeling, again, ability to have those typical relationships and to be able to discern what's real from not real. And it has a profound effect on their daily lives, their ability just to take care of themselves often. And with that, what we have to remember is that there's so much stigma associated with mental illness, and that prevents them often from seeking care. In addition to that, what we have to know, most people don't know this, that the media does us a disservice. The media makes these individuals look like they're all dangerous, and that's just not so. For the most part, these individuals with severe mental illness are more likely to be victims than they are perpetrators. They are more likely to harm themselves than someone else. Some may have a high risk of suicide. What we do to keep these individuals safe and our community safe, the best thing that we can do for them is to provide quality care. If we can keep them in care, keep them in treatment, keep them on their medication if that's what they need. Not all individuals who have a mental illness need medication, but those who do, if we can keep them on their medication, keep them in treatment, then we keep them in what we call a state of they're safe for now. They're safe for now. We may not keep them safe for all the days in the future, but we can keep them safe for now. The individuals who might be or are at higher risk for some type of violent behavior, either against others or themselves, are those who are not consistently in treatment and who are using alcohol and drugs to self-medicate, and who have a history of violent behavior or aggression. But again, I want to stress, most of these individuals they're more likely to be victims, and the research is very clear on that. They're more likely to be victims than they are perpetrators. And again, I want to stress that it's our treatment, it's our ability to get these individuals into treatment that has the highest likelihood of success, and not just treatment but also support through family, friends, and the community that has that higher likelihood of success. That said, again, there's just so much stigma associated with mental illness, and that keeps people from seeking treatment. Not only that, it keeps their families from openly discussing what their loved one is experiencing. And I've had people tell me, I'd rather my loved one have an arrest record than a mental illness. So that's really very difficult to address at times.
Now, I'm going to explain a little bit to you about a mental illness that is usually disregarded, and that is a antisocial personality disorder. Now, it is a personality disorder, which means you can't really diagnose it, and even if you do diagnose it, I mean, there's nothing you can really do for it because there is no medicine for it. It is simply something that you're born with, and to this day, scientists are still unsure of whether or not it is something that is genetically derived or something that is given out of circumstance, because it may in fact be a combination of both, and most common scholars think that it is a combination of childhood trauma and just a chemical imbalance. But a common example of this is a guy by the name of Ted Bundy. He was a very, very famous criminal in the mid-1900s. He killed over 20 men and boys in a very short period of time, a few months actually. And his case is so interesting because he was considered the most popular guy in school. Everybody loved him. He was like the town go-to dad. He was a husband, a father. He was involved in PTA, all kinds of things. He was actually very, very well liked in the community. But he killed all these people, and nobody saw it coming because he just wasn't that kind of person. And he had a whole another life. Reason being, psychopathy, or antisocial personality disorder, to be completely politically correct here, is an undetectable disorder that is usually recognized by a charming outside and a sinister inside. And it's not completely two-faced, but the people that have it usually are charming like Ted was, but in reality they have no but the people that have it usually are charming like Ted was, but in reality they have no compassion for other human beings. They only care for themselves, and they believe that everybody should go by their rules, or that they shouldn't have to follow them themselves. So it's like narcissistic and egotistical character traits put into one. It is very, very extreme selfishness. But like I said, you can't detect it, and even if you do, what's the point? I don't want you going around and thinking, everybody is psychotic or whatever, but I mean, it is something that you do need to be aware of when you're thinking about these.
Something else that we have to remember about these individuals and the difficulty of keeping them not only in treatment but keeping them at some level of recovery so that they can integrate into society and live as typically as possible is that so many are unaware that they're ill. Some of these individuals with schizophrenia, for instance, don't have insight into their illness. They don't believe that they're ill. And there's a fancy word called anosognosia that just means, again, that they lack insight and they don't believe that they're sick. Therefore, it's difficult to keep them seeing a therapist. It's difficult to keep them doing the things that we know that will increase the likelihood of wellness, and including taking their medications that have so many side effects when they don't believe that they're ill.
Seems like we're being awfully judgy here. I mean, why should we even care, you know? I mean, if somebody is crazy, shouldn't we just let them live with their craziness? I'm not saying that you should judge people that have a mental illness. What we're saying is that people like Adam Lanza or Nicholas Cruz, who are in the news so often for having a proposed mental illness, should be looked at seriously, and that we should consider what happens if we don't diagnose these things, and what the actual reasoning is behind their arguments in court. Because when we ignore that, then many more cases pop up, and that's when things go south. So I'm just saying, and I'm not going on any political side here, that we should consider what diagnostic procedures we should take. Because it shouldn't be considered as a joke, and it shouldn't be considered as just a throwaway defense in the court of law. It should be looked at very. Thank you to Dahlia Carmichael, Caitlin Hampton, and Wanda Mays for contributing to this video and helping me find the material source that I needed to give you this information.